In the winter of 1987, a social worker examining files at the Harlan County Department of Human Services discovered a thick folder marked "Sealed, Court Order Required." Inside were 14 years of reports that no one had ever investigated. What had been documented but deliberately ignored in that isolated Kentucky hollow, a case that investigators later described as one of the most disturbing instances of maternal surveillance they had encountered. Before we dive into the story, if you find yourself drawn to these hidden histories and the courage it takes to finally speak truth to power, click the like button and subscribe to the channel. Share your location and the time where you are right now. I'm always excited to see how far these stories travel and who's watching with us. Now let's continue with the story. The spring rain came down hard on Lexington that April morning when Clara Overbay pushed through the glass doors of the police station on East Main Street. She carried a cardboard box that had once held canning jars, the kind her mother used for putting up vegetables every August. Now it held something entirely different. Inside were notebooks, photographs, letters, and documents that Clara had been gathering for 2 years, hidden in a storage unit she rented under a false name 30 miles from Clover Fork Hollow. She was 24 years old, thin as a rail, with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of nights spent awake and watchful. The desk sergeant later recalled that she set the box down carefully, as though it contained something fragile and dangerous all at once. When she asked to speak with someone about filing charges against her mother, he assumed it would be a simple assault case, maybe theft. He directed her to Detective Raymond Phelps, who had worked domestic cases for the better part of a decade. Phelps met her in interview room 3, a windowless space with beige walls and a table bolted to the floor. Clara sat down and began to speak in a voice that never wavered, never broke, though what she described seemed impossible to believe. She told him about a childhood lived under constant observation, about surveillance that extended into the most private moments of her life, about a mother who documented everything with the precision of a scientist conducting an experiment. She spoke for nearly 3 hours without stopping. Phelps had heard difficult testimonies before. He had interviewed victims of violence who bore their scars on their skin and in their trembling voices. But Clara's account was different. There were no broken bones to show, no bruises that had faded over time. The damage was somewhere deeper, harder to photograph or measure. When she finished speaking, she opened the cardboard box and began removing its contents one item at a time, placing them on the table with the careful deliberation of someone building a case brick by brick. The first notebook she handed him was bound in mouton, green cloth, the kind sold at the 5 and dime in Harlan. On the cover, written in neat cursive, were the words, "Clara Louise Overbay, Daily Record, January through June 1979. Clara had been very young at the time. Phelps opened the notebook and began to read. Within 5 minutes, he felt his stomach turn. Within 10, he called his supervisor. By the end of that day, the Harlan County District Attorney had been contacted, and a file that had been sealed for years was being pulled from the archives of the Department of Human Services. What Clara had brought to that police station would eventually fill 17 boxes of evidence. What she carried inside her could never be measured in boxes at all. Clover Fork Hollow sat in a crease between 2 mountains in eastern Kentucky, the kind of place where the sun disappeared by 4 in the afternoon during winter months. The hollow had been carved out by mining operations in the 1920s, and when the coal seams played out, the company abandoned everything except the houses they couldn't be bothered to demolish. By the time Nadine and Raymond Overbay moved there in 1973, only 6 families remained, scattered along a dirt road that turned to mud whenever it rained. The Overbay house stood at the far end of that road, a converted mining supervisor's residence with 4 rooms and a basement that still smelled of coal dust. Raymond had taken a job with the electric company that kept him away 3 or 4 days each week, driving to work sites across the county. Nadine stayed home with her 3 daughters, who were all still quite young when the family arrived. To the handful of neighbors who saw them at all, they seemed like any other struggling family trying to make ends meet in a place the rest of Kentucky had forgotten. Nadine Overbay presented herself to the world as a devout woman, concerned with proper upbringing and Christian values. She wore her hair pulled back severely and favored high-necked dresses, even in summer heat. The few times she appeared at the Missionary Baptist Church in town, she sat in the back pew with her daughters arranged beside her like steps on a staircase, their hands folded identically in their laps. Pastor Hiram Colley would later testify that something about the family unsettled him, though he could never articulate exactly what. The isolation of Clover Fork served Nadine's purposes perfectly. The nearest neighbor, Widow Ethel Stamper, lived a quarter-mile down the road and rarely ventured past her own property line. The school bus picked the girls up at the mouth of the hollow, a 20-minute walk from their house. There were no playdates, no birthday parties, no casual visitors dropping by. When Raymond's sister Agnes tried to visit during Christmas of 1975, Nadine met her at the door and explained that the girls had scarlet fever, though they didn't. Agnes never tried again. Inside that house, Nadine began constructing a world governed by rules that grew stranger and more elaborate with each passing year. There were schedules for everything, meals at precisely the same time each day, bedtimes that never varied by even 5 minutes, designated hours for bathing and dressing and studying. The girls learned quickly that deviation brought consequences, though Nadine never raised her voice and rarely used physical punishment. Her methods were subtler than that. Clara's earliest memory that she could date with certainty came from early in her life, during the mid-70s. She had been playing in the yard, collecting cicada shells from the trees, when she realized she needed to use the bathroom. Instead of going inside immediately, she stayed out another 10 minutes, fascinated by the translucent abandoned exoskeletons. When she finally entered the house, her mother was standing in the kitchen with a notebook open on the counter. Nadine asked her why she had waited. Clara explained about the cicada shells. Her mother wrote something in the notebook, then told Clara that from now on, she would need to report when she felt the urge and how long she waited before responding to it. Clara thought this was strange, but she had been very inexperienced then, and people early in adulthood often assume their mothers know best. Rebecca, being the eldest, recognized earlier that something in their household operated by a logic that existed nowhere else. Nadine's response, written in her journal that night, noted that Rebecca was showing signs of external corruption that would require increased monitoring. By the late 1970s, as Clara grew older, the house on Clover Fork had become something else entirely. The routines had calcified into rituals. The monitoring had intensified beyond anything that could be called parental concern. And the 3 Overbay girls had learned that their mother watched everything, remembered everything, and wrote it all down in notebooks that filled an entire shelf in her bedroom closet. What they didn't yet know was how far that watching went, or what tools Nadine had begun acquiring to make her surveillance complete. The notebooks multiplied like something alive. By 1979, Nadine maintained separate logs for each daughter, color-coded and meticulously indexed. Green covers for Clara, blue for Rebecca, yellow for Margaret. Each entry began with the date, time, and weather conditions, as though atmospheric pressure might somehow correlate with behavior. What followed was a minute-by-minute account of activities, observations, and transgressions that Nadine deemed worthy of permanent record. Detective Phelps would later count 47 notebooks spanning the years 1973 through 1987. The early volumes read almost normally, resembling the personal record books many mothers keep, recording first words and developmental milestones. But somewhere around 1976, the tone shifted. The entries became clinical, detached, focused on bodily functions and private behaviors that most parents would never think to document. Nadine recorded bathroom visits with the precision of a medical chart: duration, frequency, any deviation from established patterns. She noted sleeping positions, noting whether her daughters slept on their backs or sides, or curled into themselves. She even tracked deeply personal aspects of their development once they reached adolescence, marking the dates in red ink with observations about mood and physical symptoms. Clara learned to recognize the sound of her mother's pen scratching across paper. It became the soundtrack of her childhood, that constant soft scritching that meant she was being observed, assessed, cataloged. Nadine kept notebooks in every room, tucked into drawers or resting on countertops, always within reach. She could produce one instantly, flipping to a blank page before Clara even finished explaining why she had come downstairs after bedtime, or why she had taken 3 pieces of bread instead of 2 at breakfast. The documentation extended beyond mere observation. Nadine began implementing what she called improvement protocols, detailed regimens designed to correct behaviors she considered problematic. If Clara bit her fingernails, Nadine created a chart tracking each instance, requiring Clara to report every time her fingers went near her mouth. If Rebecca slouched, Nadine photographed her posture at intervals throughout the day, creating a visual record of what she termed postural degradation. The photographs went into albums that Nadine stored alongside the notebooks, evidence of everything she believed required correction. Margaret, being the youngest, existed under the most intense scrutiny. Nadine documented her toilet training with scientific precision, recording every accident and success. She measured Margaret's food intake by weighing her plates before and after meals, calculating exact caloric consumption. When Margaret developed a habit of humming while she played, Nadine timed each episode and noted the circumstances that preceded it, searching for patterns that might explain this unnecessary vocalization. Raymond saw the notebooks, but never asked about their contents. Years later, when prosecutors questioned why he had not intervened, he claimed he thought his wife was simply thorough. He worked long hours and came home exhausted, he said, and Nadine had always been particular about keeping records. The household ran smoothly in his absence. The girls were well fed and clean. What more could he have asked? But Clara asked questions, at least in the beginning. As a young girl, Clara once asked why her mother needed to write down everything she did. Nadine explained that mothers had a responsibility to guide their children toward righteousness, and that required careful attention to behavior. How could she help Clara improve if she didn't know precisely what needed improving? The logic seemed sound enough to a 10-year-old girl who trusted that her mother wanted what was best for her. As she grew older, Clara eventually stopped asking. She had learned that questions became their own entries in the notebooks, flagged as resistant behavior or questioning maternal authority. She watched her older sister Rebecca struggle against the system and saw how Nadine responded by intensifying her monitoring, adding new categories of observation, creating additional protocols. Resistance made things worse, not better. So Clara became quiet and compliant, performing her daily routines with mechanical precision, while something inside her withdrew to a place her mother's notebooks could not reach. The documentation had become total, inescapable. But Nadine was not finished. The notebooks recorded what she could see and hear. What came next would eliminate even the possibility of privacy, transforming the house itself into an instrument of surveillance that captured everything her daughters tried to keep hidden. The bathroom door lost its lock in the spring of 1980, though Nadine explained it away as a safety measure. What if one of the girls fell and injured herself? What if she needed help? The girls accepted this reasoning because they had no choice, and because they were still young enough to believe that mothers made decisions for good reasons. What began as an absent lock evolved into something far more invasive. Nadine instituted scheduled bathroom times, posted on a chart in the hallway. Each daughter had designated windows for bathing and using the toilet, and deviation from the schedule required written permission obtained at least 1 hour in advance. Clara learned to regulate her body's needs according to the clock, training herself to wait until her assigned time, even when urgency demanded otherwise. The inspections started gradually. At first, Nadine simply checked that the bathroom had been left clean after use. Then she began requiring her daughters to report what they had done during their bathroom time, creating new sections in the notebooks specifically for these logs. By the early 80s, as Clara continued to mature, Nadine had expanded the system to include what she called hygiene verification. She required her daughters to present themselves after bathing for inspection, checking that they had washed thoroughly and properly. She examined their clothing afterward, looking for signs of what she termed inadequate cleanliness. The journals recovered from the Overbay house contained pages dedicated to these inspections. Nadine recorded her observations in language that read like medical documentation, clinical and detached. She noted skin conditions, developing bodies, anything she deemed irregular or concerning. When Rebecca first began experiencing significant hormonal changes, Nadine began tracking her cycles with obsessive detail, requiring Rebecca to report the specifics of her periods and submit soiled items for inspection to ensure she was managing her hygiene appropriately. Clara tried to preserve some dignity by rushing through her bathroom time, but Nadine countered this by implementing minimum duration requirements. Baths must last at least 15 minutes, but no more than 20. Using the toilet required checking in and out, with Nadine timing the interval to ensure Clara wasn't lingering unnecessarily or finishing too quickly, either of which she flagged as abnormal. The bathroom became a space of acute anxiety, where Clara performed her most basic human functions under the weight of impending scrutiny. Margaret, still quite young at the time, developed such severe constipation that a doctor eventually prescribed medication. The physician noted in his records that the child seemed unusually anxious about discussing her symptoms. He attributed this to normal childhood embarrassment. He did not ask why Margaret tracked her bathroom activities on a chart she brought to the appointment, or why she seemed terrified of providing incorrect information about her bowel movements. The protocols extended beyond the physical. Nadine began monitoring water usage, checking that the appropriate amount had been used for each activity. Too much water meant wasteful bathing or unapproved activities. Too little suggested inadequate hygiene. She installed a calendar above the bathroom sink, where each daughter was required to initial after completing her designated bathroom time, creating yet another layer of documentation and control. Rebecca attempted to push back as she entered her later adolescence. She began taking longer baths, using more hot water than allocated, spending extra time behind the closed door. Nadine responded by removing the door entirely for 2 weeks, citing Rebecca's inability to follow household guidelines. Raymond was home when this happened and said nothing, retreating to the basement where he claimed he needed to repair the water heater. Rebecca never challenged the protocols again. Clara absorbed the lesson her sister had learned at such cost. She became invisible in her compliance, performing each required ritual with perfect precision. She bathed in exactly 17 minutes. She reported her bathroom activities with clinical accuracy. She presented herself for inspection without flinching. But inside, she began constructing a different kind of documentation, a mental catalog of everything her mother did, every rule that exceeded reason, every invasion that crossed into territory that even her child's mind recognized as wrong. The bathroom protocols were not the worst of what Nadine had planned. They were merely preparation for a surveillance system that would eliminate the last refuge her daughters possessed, the only place they still believed belonged to themselves alone. Clara discovered the first hole on a Tuesday afternoon in October of 1982. The autumn light slanted through her bedroom window at an angle that illuminated dust motes and, for the first time, a small circular opening in the wall beside her dresser. It was perhaps the diameter of a pencil, positioned at eye level if someone were standing in the adjacent room, which happened to be her mother's sewing area. She approached the hole slowly, that instinct children have when they sense they are about to learn something that will change everything. She pressed her eye close and saw directly into the sewing room, the angle perfectly calculated to capture her bed, her desk, the corner where she changed clothes. The hole had been drilled with precision, then concealed with a small piece of fabric that could be moved aside. Someone standing in that sewing room could watch her entire bedroom without her knowledge. Clara spent the next hour searching. She found 3 more holes in her room alone, each positioned to eliminate blind spots, creating a network of observation points that covered every inch of her private space. Her hands shook as she moved a picture frame and discovered another opening, this one aimed at the corner where she kept her diary hidden beneath a loose floorboard. That diary had never been private at all. She checked Rebecca's room next while her sister was still at school. 5 holes, strategically placed. Margaret's room had 4. The bathroom, which they all shared, had 2. Drilled through the wall that adjoined the hallway linen closet. Someone could stand in that closet and watch them bathe, watch them use the toilet, watch every moment they believed was unobserved. When confronted that evening, Nadine did not deny it. She sat at the kitchen table with her hands folded and explained in that same calm voice she used for everything. A mother had a duty to know what her daughters did in private, she said. Children behaved differently when they thought no one was watching, and those private behaviors revealed their true character. She had installed the observation points 3 years earlier, she told Clara, after reading an article about parental vigilance in a Christian magazine. The article had suggested that modern parents gave children too much unsupervised time, allowing sin to take root in secret places. Clara asked if their father knew. Nadine said Raymond had helped her drill the holes during one of his weekends home, though he claimed later, under oath, that he thought they were installing ventilation to prevent mold. Prosecutors never determined whether he was lying or whether he had truly been that willfully blind. That night, Clara lay in bed staring at the ceiling, aware of the holes surrounding her like eyes in the darkness. She thought about all the times she had believed herself alone, all the private moments of changing clothes, of crying into her pillow, of the innocent explorations of her developing body that every adolescent experiences. None of it had been private. Her mother had been watching through those holes, standing in adjacent rooms, observing and probably recording in those endless notebooks what she witnessed. Rebecca's reaction was different when Clara told her. She went into their mother's sewing room and stuffed cloth into every hole she could reach. Nadine discovered this within hours and instituted new rules. The girls were forbidden to enter any room except their own bedrooms, the bathroom during designated times, and common areas when supervised. Rebecca's defiance earned her a week of sleeping in the basement, where Nadine said she could reflect on her disrespect. The holes remained unplugged. The discovery shattered something fundamental in Clara's understanding of the world. She had believed, despite everything else, that her bedroom belonged to her. That illusion was gone. She began sleeping in her clothes. She changed in the bathroom during her allocated time, moving quickly, always aware that even there, eyes watched through concealed openings. She stopped writing in her diary entirely, understanding now that every word had been read, every private thought harvested and catalogued. The house had become a panopticon, and they were its prisoners. But the watching eyes and documented behaviors were only symptoms of something deeper, a corruption in Nadine's thinking that would soon attract attention from beyond Clover Fork Hollow. The first report came from Clara's 8th grade English teacher, Mrs. Judith Carmichael, in February of 1981. She had noticed that Clara flinched whenever anyone approached her from behind, and that the girl asked permission for everything, even things like retrieving a pencil from her own backpack. During a parent-teacher conference, Mrs. Carmichael mentioned that Clara seemed unusually anxious. Nadine responded by producing a notebook from her purse, opening it to show detailed logs of Clara's behavior at home, explaining that she was working with Clara on her nervousness through careful monitoring and structure. Mrs. Carmichael found this dedication impressive rather than alarming. But something nagged at her after that meeting. She filed a report with Harlan County Social Services in March, noting her concerns about Clara's extreme anxiety and what she described as unusual parental documentation practices. The report was assigned to caseworker Dennis Mullins, who had a caseload of 63 families across 500 square miles of mountain territory. He sent a letter to the Overbay household requesting a home visit. Nadine responded with a typed letter explaining that the family kept irregular hours due to Raymond's work schedule, and suggesting that any concerns could be addressed through written correspondence. Mullins, overwhelmed and understaffed, accepted this and closed the case after Nadine sent him 3 pages of documentation proving Clara received adequate food, clothing, and medical care. The second report arrived in November of 1983, filed by the school nurse after Rebecca came to her office for the 3rd time in 2 weeks, complaining of stomach pain. During the examination, the nurse noticed that Rebecca seemed terrified of being late returning to class, checking the clock obsessively and growing increasingly agitated as time passed. When asked about home life, Rebecca said only that her mother had rules and she needed to follow them. The nurse documented her concerns and contacted social services, specifically noting that Rebecca displayed signs consistent with anxiety disorder and possible controlling home environment. This report landed on the desk of Margaret Hoskins, a newer caseworker with only 2 years of experience. She scheduled a home visit for a Friday afternoon in December. When she arrived at the house in Clover Fork, Nadine greeted her with coffee and homemade cookies. The house was immaculate. All 3 daughters sat in the living room with perfect posture, answering questions politely when addressed. Hoskins asked to speak with each girl privately, but Nadine explained that she did not allow her daughters to speak with strangers without supervision, citing safety concerns. When Hoskins pressed the issue, Nadine produced documentation of Rebecca's recent medical checkup, her report cards showing good grades, and photographs of the family at church functions. Hoskins noted in her report that while the mother seemed rigid, there was no evidence of physical abuse or neglect. The case was closed within a week. The third report came in April of 1984 from Rebecca's guidance counselor, who at that point was in her later teens, crying in the school library. Rebecca had whispered that she could not live like this anymore, that her mother watched everything, that there was nowhere she could be alone. But when the counselor asked specific questions, Rebecca shut down completely, saying she had spoken incorrectly and everything was fine. The counselor filed the report anyway, noting that Rebecca seemed genuinely distressed and possibly living under excessive parental control. This report never received a response. Budget cuts had reduced the social services staff by 40% that year. The Overbay file was marked as a duplicate concern from a family already investigated twice with negative findings. The report was filed away in the growing stack of cases that lacked the resources for follow-up. Years later, Dennis Mullins would testify that he still thought about the Overbay case, wondered if he should have pushed harder for that home visit. Margaret Hoskins would describe the immaculate house and polite daughters, admitting she had seen only what Nadine wanted her to see. The guidance counselor kept copies of Rebecca's file and told the court she knew something was deeply wrong, but had no evidence that would compel intervention. 3 professionals had documented concerns. 3 times, the system had failed to protect the Overbay daughters. And in that failure, the surveillance in Clover Fork Hollow continued unchecked, intensifying toward a breaking point that would nearly cost Rebecca her life. Rebecca swallowed the pills on a Wednesday evening in March of 1985, not long after entering adulthood. She had been collecting them for months, taking 1 or 2 at a time from the medicine cabinet whenever she had the opportunity, hiding them in a sock at the back of her drawer. She chose a night when Raymond was away on a job and Nadine had gone to bed early with a migraine. Clara found her sister unconscious on the bathroom floor an hour later. The emergency room at Harlan County Hospital admitted Rebecca at 11:43 that night. Dr. Paul Hendricks pumped her stomach and administered activated charcoal while nurses monitored her vital signs. She remained unconscious until dawn, and when she finally opened her eyes, the first thing she asked was whether her mother was angry. Dr. Hendricks found this question more disturbing than the suicide attempt itself. He was a practical man in his late 50s who had seen poverty and desperation in every form during his 30 years practicing medicine in eastern Kentucky. But something about Rebecca's terror struck him as wrong in a way he could not immediately articulate. When Nadine arrived at the hospital that morning, she brought a notebook. She asked detailed questions about Rebecca's treatment and wrote down every answer, documenting the incident with the same clinical precision she applied to everything else. Dr. Hendricks watched her take notes on her daughter's attempted suicide and felt his unease crystallize into suspicion. He requested a psychiatric evaluation before Rebecca's discharge. The on-call psychiatrist, Dr. Ellen Vargas, spent 2 hours with Rebecca that afternoon. The girl spoke haltingly at first, then in a torrent, describing a home life that sounded like something from a dystopian novel. She talked about the holes in the walls, the bathroom protocols, the constant documentation, the complete absence of privacy or autonomy. She said she had tried to kill herself because she could not imagine living another year under her mother's surveillance. Dr. Vargas documented everything and immediately contacted social services. She marked her report as urgent, recommending that the Overbay daughters be removed from the home pending investigation. The report reached the county office on a Friday afternoon. The caseworker on duty that weekend was not familiar with the family's history. She pulled the file and saw 2 previous investigations that had found no evidence of abuse. Dr. Vargas's report described psychological abuse, which in 1985, Kentucky had no clear legal definition and no established protocols for intervention. The caseworker made a phone call to the Overbay house on Saturday morning. Nadine answered and expressed appropriate maternal concern about Rebecca's mental health. She explained that Rebecca had always been prone to dramatic behavior and that the family was dealing with typical teenage adjustment issues. She mentioned that Rebecca had been struggling academically and socially, which was completely false, but impossible to verify over a weekend. The caseworker noted that the mother seemed cooperative and concerned, and decided that an in-person visit could wait until the following week. By Monday, the case had been transferred to a different worker due to scheduling conflicts. This worker reviewed the file, saw multiple previous investigations with negative findings, and determined that while a home visit was warranted, it was not an emergency. The visit was scheduled for 3 weeks later. Before that appointment could occur, the case was closed. Someone in the administrative chain, reviewing the backlog of pending investigations, saw that the Overbay family had been investigated multiple times without substantiation, and made a decision that this was harassment of a family already under scrutiny. The file was stamped closed and returned to archives. Rebecca came home from the hospital after 5 days. Nadine had added a new section to her notebooks during that time, labeled Mental Health Monitoring. She began documenting Rebecca's moods, her eating patterns, her sleep, searching for warning signs of another attempt. The surveillance intensified rather than lessened. Clara watched all of this unfold and understood something crucial. The system would not save them. No matter how many times someone reported concerns, no matter how many professionals sensed something wrong, the machinery of intervention was too slow, too skeptical, too overwhelmed to act. If she and her sisters were going to escape, they would have to save themselves. And escape would require evidence so overwhelming, so meticulously documented, that it could not be dismissed or explained away. Clara decided to become her mother's student, learning the art of surveillance and turning it against its master. She just needed to survive long enough to gather what she needed. Clara began her documentation in the summer of 1985, 3 months after Rebecca's hospitalization. She was in her later adolescence and understood that she needed to think in terms of years, not months. Evidence collected hastily would be incomplete, easy to dismiss. She needed the kind of systematic record that could withstand legal scrutiny, the kind that even her mother would have to respect for its thoroughness. She started by stealing one of Nadine's old notebooks from a box in the basement, a volume from 1977 that her mother had apparently decided was no longer relevant. Clara hid it inside her mattress, cutting a small opening in the fabric and tucking it deep into the stuffing. Each night, after the house went dark and she heard her mother's bedroom door close, she would extract the notebook and write by moonlight, documenting everything she could remember about the surveillance system, the protocols, the invasions. She photographed the holes in the walls using a camera she stole from the school's art department, returning it the next day before anyone noticed its absence. She took pictures during her allocated bathroom time, angling the camera to capture the observation points drilled through into the linen closet. She documented the schedules posted in the hallway, the charts tracking their bodily functions, the inspection routines. Each photograph was dated on the back in tiny handwriting and hidden with the notebook. The hardest part was stealing her mother's journals. Nadine kept them locked in a cabinet in her bedroom, but Clara had learned to pick simple locks by practicing on the bathroom door after Nadine installed a new one. Over 2 years, she carefully removed journals one at a time, took them to the public library in Harlan, where she made photocopies, then returned them before they could be missed. She learned her mother's patterns, knew which days Nadine grocery shopped, which afternoons she visited the church. Each stolen hour was terrifying and necessary. By December of 1986, Clara had filled 3 notebooks of her own and collected copies of 17 of her mother's journals. She had photograph evidence, eyewitness accounts she had written down from conversations with her sisters, and medical records she had obtained by forging her mother's signature at the county health department. She rented a storage unit in Lexington, using money she had saved from a part-time job at the grocery store, paying cash and using a false name. The evidence went into a cardboard box in that unit, safe and hidden. She left on a January morning in 1987, 3 weeks after her 21st birthday. She told Nadine she was going to work, walked to the bus stop as usual, but did not get off at the grocery store. She rode the bus to its final stop in Lexington, retrieved the box from storage, and checked into a motel, using money she had been hiding for 2 years. She spent 3 months in that motel room, organizing her evidence, writing out a comprehensive statement, preparing for the moment when she would finally speak. When she walked into the police station in April, Detective Phelps initially assumed she was exaggerating, that family conflict had been blown out of proportion in her mind. Then he opened the first notebook. Then he saw the photographs. Then he began reading Nadine's journals, page after page of surveillance records that documented violations so systematic and thorough that they defied ordinary understanding of maternal behavior. Phelps called the district attorney that afternoon. By evening, they had contacted the Kentucky State Police. The investigation expanded rapidly once professionals understood the scope of what had occurred in Clover Fork Hollow. A judge issued a search warrant for the Overbay residence, and on a Friday morning in late April, investigators descended on the house with cameras, evidence bags, and a growing sense that they were documenting a situation that many involved felt was unlike anything they had personally encountered. They found everything Clara had described. The holes in the walls were still there, some plugged with tissue, but most still functional. The notebooks filled an entire closet, organized by year and child. The bathroom charts remained posted. The locked cabinet in Nadine's room contained journals going back 14 years, a complete record of surveillance that had consumed thousands of hours of observation and documentation. Investigators photographed everything, cataloged every notebook, measured every observation hole. Nadine was arrested that afternoon and charged with multiple counts of child abuse. Raymond, who had been living in the house throughout everything, was charged as an accessory. Both were released on bond pending trial. And in Lexington, Clara finally allowed herself to sleep without listening for footsteps outside her door. The trial began in October of 1987 in Harlan County Circuit Court. Nadine Overbay sat at the defense table in a modest dress, her hair pulled back as always, her expression one of wounded bewilderment. Her attorney argued that she had been an attentive mother, whose dedication had been twisted into something sinister by a rebellious daughter. He presented character witnesses who testified that Nadine was a devout churchgoer, a woman of principle who had raised her children with structure and discipline in an era when such things were increasingly rare. The prosecution faced a challenge that would have been insurmountable in earlier decades. There were no broken bones, no scars, no physical evidence of violence. What Nadine had done existed in a gray area of law that Kentucky statutes had not adequately addressed. Psychological abuse was difficult to quantify, harder still to prosecute. The district attorney built his case on the sheer accumulation of evidence, the relentless documentation of invasion that the notebooks represented. Clara testified for 6 hours across 2 days. She spoke in that same steady voice she had used in the police station, describing her childhood with precision and without dramatics. She explained the bathroom protocols, the observation holes, the constant surveillance that had shaped every moment of her life from age 4 onward. Defense counsel tried to rattle her during cross-examination, suggesting she was motivated by vindictiveness. But Clara simply produced another document, another photograph, another piece of evidence that corroborated her account. Rebecca testified next, her voice shaking but determined. She told the jury about the night she tried to kill herself, about the years of living in a house where privacy did not exist. Margaret, now 14, spoke last. She described growing up believing that all mothers watched their daughters through holes in walls, that all families operated under rigid protocols and constant documentation. She had thought this was normal until Clara showed her otherwise. The defense presented Nadine's journals as evidence of good parenting, arguing that thorough record-keeping demonstrated maternal concern. This strategy backfired spectacularly when the prosecutor read selected passages aloud, letting the jury hear Nadine's clinical descriptions of her daughter's most private moments. The courtroom grew increasingly uncomfortable as the scope of the surveillance became undeniable. Raymond took the stand in his own defense, claiming ignorance of the extent of his wife's behavior. He admitted helping drill what he thought were ventilation holes, but insisted he had not known their true purpose. The prosecutor produced evidence that Raymond had been present during bathroom inspections, that he had seen the notebooks, that he had chosen comfort over intervention. Raymond received 3 years probation as an accessory to child abuse. The jury deliberated for 11 hours. They convicted Nadine on 4 counts of psychological abuse and 2 counts of invasion of privacy. The judge, working within the limited sentencing guidelines available for such crimes in 1987, gave her 8 years in prison. Some observers described the sentence as unusually significant for a case centered on non-physical abuse. Victims' advocates thought it grossly inadequate for 14 years of systematic torture. Nadine showed no emotion when the verdict was read. She was led from the courtroom still maintaining that she had only wanted to protect her daughters from sin, that she had been a devoted mother, misunderstood by a society that no longer valued parental authority. She served 5 years before being released on parole in 1992. She never acknowledged wrongdoing. She never apologized. Clara did not attend the parole hearing. By then, she had moved forward into a life her mother could no longer touch. Clara built her life in Louisville, 200 miles from Clover Fork Hollow. She earned a degree in social work, then a master's in child psychology. By 1995, she was working for Kentucky's Department of Children and Family Services, the same agency that had failed to save her. She rewrote protocols, trained caseworkers to recognize psychological abuse, testified before the state legislature about the gaps in child protection laws. According to later accounts, the case was discussed in some training circles as an example of psychological control. Rebecca married young and moved to Ohio, cutting all contact with Kentucky and everyone in it, including Clara for several years. Margaret struggled with anxiety disorders throughout her 20s, but eventually became a therapist specializing in family trauma. The 3 sisters reunited gradually, carefully, learning to be family without the weight of surveillance crushing them. Raymond died of a heart attack in 2003. Nadine outlived him by 11 years, spending her final decade in a nursing home in Harlan. She never stopped maintaining that she had been a good mother. Clara visited her once, in 2013, a month before Nadine's death. She needed to ask one question that had haunted her for 26 years. They sat in the nursing home common room, two women who shared blood and nothing else. Clara asked why. Why the surveillance? Why the obsessive documentation? Why the complete annihilation of her daughter's privacy and autonomy? Nadine's answer was not what Clara expected. She said she had been protecting them from what happened to her. Then Nadine told her story for the first and only time. She had grown up in that same house in Clover Fork Hollow, raised by a father who did unspeakable things in the darkness while her mother looked away. She had kept diaries as a child, documenting the abuse in desperate detail, but no one ever read them. When she finally showed them to a teacher at age 15, the teacher told her she was making up wicked lies and burned the notebooks in front of her. Nadine learned that documentation without witnesses meant nothing, that privacy enabled evil, that constant vigilance was the only protection. So she had watched her own daughters every moment, documented everything, eliminated all privacy because privacy was where monsters lived. She had become the witness she never had, the mother who saw everything because no one had seen her. Her surveillance was not cruelty, but protection, twisted through the lens of her own shattered childhood into something unrecognizable as love. Clara sat in stunned silence, understanding for the first time that her mother had been both monster and victim, that trauma had metastasized across generations into new forms of damage. It did not excuse what Nadine had done. It explained it. There was a difference. Nadine died 3 weeks later. Clara did not attend the funeral. Today, Clara is 59 years old. She still works in child protection, still fights for children who live in houses where something is deeply wrong, but hard to prove. She has never married, never had children of her own. The surveillance shaped her in ways she is still discovering. But she is not broken. She is the witness who finally spoke, the daughter who escaped, the advocate who turned her mother's methods into tools for protecting others. And sometimes, in the quiet of her apartment, she writes in notebooks of her own, documenting her life not because someone is watching, but because she finally has the freedom to remember on her own terms. If this story has moved you, if it has made you think about the hidden suffering that exists behind closed doors, click the like button and subscribe to this channel. These stories need to be told. These voices need to be heard. And your engagement ensures that we can continue bringing light to the darkest corners of history. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Truth, no matter how painful, deserves witnesses.